Alrighty, y'all, welcome back. And now that we have our basic UI put together, as the next step, I want to go ahead and start setting up Redux. However, before we set up any Redux state management tools to manage this app data, what I want to do is kind of take a step back and I'll show you how all the data is organized in Redux for TNBOS. So let me go ahead and open my DevTools and I'll pop open this Redux tab and I'll show you what we have so far, and you'll probably get a pretty good idea of how we're going to structure this. So right now at the very top level, our store contains two objects. One is nested under system and one is nested under chat. So we'll start with system right here. Since this system data, if we expand it, you'll see that all of the TNBOS internal system data, and this includes things like your accounts and your networks, and also like the currently the active app, which means the app that's currently displaying on the screen. All of what you would probably imagine, like the internal system data, this is all going to be stored under system. Now, for each application that we build, the app also needs to maintain its own data. For example, this chat, it needs to know, well, I only have one account in here right now, but what is the currently active account? It needs to store your messages. It needs to store like the delivery status if the message was delivered. So all of this is going to be nested under an app ID, and the app ID for chat is chat. So if you just expand this, you can see, well, we don't have any messages, but for example, the manager right here is going to keep track of the currently active chat, so on and so forth. So anyways, we don't need to dig into this chat store too much, but what I'm basically just saying is that the structure at a very high level, it's going to have system, and then each app is going to maintain its own data under a key, which is going to be the same as its app ID. So eventually we're going to have system, chat, and speed test, and that's what we're going to be doing in this video, setting up our speed test data. Now, in addition to Redux, we're also going to be using a tool called Electron Store, and this is going to allow us to persist our app data to our hard drive. And that way, whenever we shut down TNBOS or just shut down our computer and open it again, all of our data is going to be there. We're not going to have to reselect the network and account again, and all of our historical data is going to be nice and saved from last time. So pretty cool. And on that note, I did want to mention one detail as well. So you see how in Redux, I'll use the chat app as an example. You see how in Redux, what we have is at a top level, all this data is stored under the app ID. So for example, if we want to access our chat messages, we would type something like chat.messages to access these. Well, whenever we store this data in the Electron store, that structure is going to be flattened out a little bit. And by that, I mean, let me pop this open. So again, instead of chat.messages, we're just going to flatten it out and store it under a key called chat messages. So kind of the camel case version of that dot separator notation. However, the reason that we do this is just because whenever we work with Electron Store, it just makes some things easier. So that's why we're doing it, just to give you some background context. And with that said, the plan is to just go ahead and get started setting up our Redux store. And once we have that structure set up, then we're going to go back through each of these components one by one and pretty much just start hooking them up, making them work, everything from the top down. So before we can start actually creating our store, what I want to do first is go ahead and create some new data types, because we want to define the shape of data that's going to be stored in our Redux store. So under speed test, I'm going to create a new directory. I'm going to call it types. And the first type that I want to create is going to be in a file called manager.ts. And for this, I'm going to create an interface. And this is just going to be called manager. And what I'm going to do in this manager little chunk of data right here, this manager object, is it's going to store the currently selected network and the currently selected account. So I thought manager was a decent name for that. And I also am following the same pattern as chat. In the chat manager, we store things like the currently selected chat app right there. So anyways, there's some background info. So again, under manager, we're going to do active account number. And this is going to be equal to a string or null, because when the app is first initialized, it's going to be null. And then whenever they click that pencil icon and select one, then we're going to store that account number as a string under this. And we're going to do the same thing for active network. So active network ID. Again, we don't want to store the network object because I'll show you this. The source of truth for the network object is going to be stored under system. You can see under the new Boston network, this is the ID, but we also store other information like the display name, the display image, the protocol, so on and so forth. Now, if we were just to store this entire network object in, let me pop this open right here, then we're almost going to have like two sources of the truth. So instead, we just want to store the unique identifier, and anytime we need to pull that logo or display name or anything like that, then we're just going to reference the system data. But either way, under manager, we're going to be storing the active account number, active network ID, and this is good to go. So this is good for manager, again, basically storing the state for these top elements right here. Now, what I also want to do is create a separate type to store these items right here. Now, initially I wanted to call these tests, and then I wanted to call them speed test. But the reason that I don't want to call them anything with test in the name, even though that's kind of intuitively how I think about it, is that whenever we are writing our test, I was just imagining in my head, well, just like a million naming conflicts, and it's probably going to be kind of messy looking. So instead, I am calling these things a run. So again, a run is basically what you create whenever you hit this button. It's going to send a request off to another device, and then we're going to get a response back. And all of that is going to be stored in one of these things called a run. So anyways, that's the background of that name. And on that note, let me go ahead and create a new type file, and I'll just say run.ts. And for this, export interface run. And all right, so what info do we need here? Well, the first thing I want to store is the network ID, and this is just going to be equal to a string. In other words, let me pop this open. It's going to be equal to this right here. Now, the reason that I want to store this is because whenever I send a request through a specific network, for example, let's say that I want to connect to my MacBook over the new Boston network. Whenever my MacBook sends back a response, I want to ensure that it's sending it back on the same exact network. Now, if it's like, yeah, of course it would. Well, remember that we have that fault tolerance logic where if one network goes down, the app is able to communicate through another network. However, I want to kind of hard code this in because just some validation later on. I don't want to like be testing the new Boston network and receive a response through another network and then have my times all messed up. So let me just go ahead and store that right there. Now, another key that we're going to need is the recipient. And this is just going to be the account number of, for example, my whatever device I send it to, for example, my MacBook. And then the request date. This is actually going to be a date time object, and we're always going to have it. So that's actually stored as a string. And then we are also going to have a response date. So anyways, just some context between this. Whenever we send a block to another device, we of course have to say what network we're sending it over, who is supposed to be receiving it. And this request date, as soon as we send it, we're going to set this request date. They're going to respond pretty much like a ping pong cycle. And whenever we get a response back, then we're going to set the response date. So this response date is going to be a string. However, it's also going to be null sometimes. So whenever we first send this request and we haven't received a response yet, we're still waiting for it, it's going to be equal to null. And again, like I said, as soon as we get one back, then we're going to calculate what the time is and set it as a response date. And whenever we do response date, pretty much the difference between request date and response date, that's going to give us how fast this request response was. Now, another thing that I'm going to add in is just an ID for basically this object. Now, a lot of the times whenever you're forming like entities in a database, you call the ID either like PK or ID or UUID. However, when I was developing TNBOS, it got kind of confusing since so many things had ID in the name. And I know this is not really convention, but well, I guess this entire operating system, quote unquote, isn't really conventional either. But anyways, moral of the story is I started naming everything the entity type and then ID, and it's just a lot more intuitive whenever we are like communicating with other devices, as you're going to see soon. So this run ID is just going to be a unique ID. It's going to be a UUID. So that's going to be stored as a string. And aside from this, we're actually going to have one more value in here. But before we do that, I'll go ahead and create an enum called run status. So this run status is either going to be equal to pending, and it's going to be pending whenever we first send it out, but we haven't received the response yet. It can also be equal to success, and we'll set it equal to success once we get a successful response back, of course. Now, another status that I want to make is a timeout status, and this is whenever we send this request, plop this open again. Whenever we hit go and send a request, if we'll say like more than 10 seconds has passed and we still haven't heard anything back from the other device, then we'll just consider this run timed out and we'll set it equal to timeout. That way we aren't like waiting for this response for an infinite amount of time. So on that note, let me just do pending equal pending and then success and timeout. All right, and now for the run, we're gonna store it under status, and this is equal to a run status. So again, by default, we'll set it equal to pending, and then depending on how it goes, either success or timeout to kind of finish it off. Now, the way that we're actually gonna structure this in Redux is, even though we're gonna be storing basically a collection of these, I don't wanna store them as an array because it makes like finding it, updating the array, and just kind of updating everything a little difficult. So we'll follow the same structure as we do. Let me see what example I can show you. For accounts, for example. So you see under accounts right here, we have this account data including the display name and display image. However, everything isn't stored in a list. It's actually an object keyed by its unique identifier. So for example, this account's unique identifier is this account number AAA yada yada yada. So again, the reason that we do this is because it's a lot easier just to say the account number. I'm gonna update whatever information this is. It's I don't know, it's faster too than having to go through an array, iterate, and try to find everything. So for this, again, we're going to be storing this under a key, which is going to be its run ID. And to make this a little bit easier, we have, I'll type this out first, system.types generic. And I'll show you what this dict type is. Basically saying that whatever we specify is the type, then its key is going to be a string, and the type is just going to be whatever object. So export type runs is going to be equal to a dict or dictionary of runs. Now, another thing I want to do before we hop into our store is create a new file called constants. And you know how I said before that just like our chat app, I'll show you chat store constants, how whenever we're working with the Electron store, we pretty much convert that dot notation to this camel case notation just because it makes some things easier. That's what we'll do right here. So I'll make export const, and I'll say speed test manager. And this is just going to be the key for this right here. And again, the camel case is first the camel case version of the app name, and then whatever slice, in this case it's manager, and then we're going to do the same thing for run right here. So speed test runs, and this is just equal to speed test runs. And again, I just want to use constants for these, so anytime we have to refer to this key, we aren't like prone to typos. we can use the constant and it's just a lot less error prone. So closing this and closing this, another thing that I like to do, let me hop back in my speed test store right here, or speed test typing, is I like to go ahead and create a file called index. And I'm pretty much just going to import all of my different types into this one index file. And this just makes it easier whenever you're importing these types later on. You only have to import from one file rather than kind of having a million imports at the top of your file. So the first thing I'm going to import is this manager. So import manager from apps, speed test types manager. And then we're also going to be importing run. What was it? Runs and run status. From runs. And we'll just export everything. So export manager and all of this. And this was actually supposed to be runs. All right, good to go. And while I am at it, let me actually go ahead and type out my Electron store too. So I'll make another TypeScript file called Electron store. And again, this is going to be how our data is stored using that Electron store, basically how our data is stored on the hard drive. And remember that we are going to key everything under these constants right here. So, well, I first need to import those. So speed test manager and speed test runs from apps speed test constants. And what we can actually just import the data as well. So types. All right. So the shape of this, and what could we call it? Speed. So the shape of our data in the Electron store, in other words, our hard drive, first of all, our manager data is going to be under the key speed test manager. And what is going to be the shape of this data? Just manager. Again, just this right here. And then we also are going to be storing our runs. In other words, these right here. And that is going to be stored under the key speed test runs. And what's the shape of that data? It's just a dictionary of runs. So basically a dictionary of these. All right, and by the way, this is going to be the exact same as how we store it in Redux, just using dot notation instead of these keys right here. But now with that, let me actually go ahead and import that as well. Okay, so again, everything cleaned up into this one file. And there you go. So all of our types are unified under types index.ts. We can now get started with our Redux store. So first thing I'm going to do is create a new directory called store. And also I'm going to move this constants file under store. I created it in the wrong location. And all right, so store constants, there we go. Okay. Now, all right, so how are we going to set up our Redux store? Well, what we could do is we could just create one gigantic file to manage all of our state logic. However, if we do that, it's going to be a real pain to keep all of our different data organized. So instead, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating one file for each slice. And we can think of a slice just as a chunk of data. And to make things a little bit more clear, I'll show you how we did it in the chat app. So in the chat app, we have a couple different objects that we store data under: contacts, the delivery status, the manager, messages. Each of these things right here are their own slice. So the slice is pretty much the object that's directly nested under the main app ID. So that's what we're going to be doing. We'll eventually have two slices, one for the manager and then one for the runs. So let's go ahead and pop open our editor and we can just create those two files right now. So TypeScript file called manager and then another one called runs. And let's start with the manager. So this manager slice right here is again going to maintain the data for what is the currently selected network and what is the currently selected account. So in this manager file, let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing that we need to do is import some stuff from Redux Toolkit. Actually, let me do this from redux.js toolkit. The first thing is a function called create slice, which is, well, you'll see in just a bit exactly what it is, but a helper function that allows us to create this slice of data or chunk of Redux data. And then we'll use something called current and payload action. Now, another thing that we need to import is from our constants, this speed test manager. So import speed test manager from apps. And then we need to, or we're going to be needing to give it the type of data that we're going to store. So reference that manager, and that is import manager from app speed test types. And then some other things, which we're going to be getting into these in a little bit, but another thing that we're going to need is IPC channel. And for this, I'll talk more about IPC whenever we get into kind of after the app development tutorials, once we like look at the internals of TMBOS, see how it works. For now, just know that IPC is needed whenever we use that Electron store, because our Electron app basically needs to use Node to communicate with our operating system and store data on it. Again, not really relevant. It's kind of relevant now, but it's a little getting too deep in the woods for this app development tutorial, so I'll save this for a little bit later. Now, aside from that, one other thing that we're going to need is another util related to that IPC. So system utils.ipc, and that is set local and state reducer. And we'll see what that does in just a bit. Now, what we're going to be doing to set up this slice is we're going to be creating a manager variable, and this is going to be equal to this create slice object, or this create slice function right here. So this create slice function, which is a helper function that Redux Toolkit gives us, it's going to require three main pieces of information. It's going to require a name, which is really just a unique name for our slice, and it's not super important. However, I'll show you how it's used. If you look at your Redux log right here, you can see that whenever Redux is going to auto-generate some of these action type names in the background, it's going to use whatever name we give it as a prefix. So for example, the chat manager, all of these action types are prefixed with this name. So again, just know that you have to throw in a unique name in here, and Redux Toolkit's going to do some stuff in the background, but it's like we don't have to like reference it or really care about it at all anymore. Another thing is the initial state, and let me just go ahead and probably type these out. It's probably going to be easier. So the initial state for this manager is first of all, what type is it going to be? And this is going to be of type manager. And if we look at that type right now, let me clean some of these up. So if we look at the manager type, what info does it require? Well, it requires an active account number, and a valid value for active account number is either a string, which is going to be the actual account number, or null. And since this is the initial state and we don't have an account number yet, we're just going to set that equal to null. And same thing with active network ID. So when this app is first initialized, of course, we don't have any data. We're just going to initialize both of those values to null. And then in our app, it'll say something like select a network or select an account. All right, so now that we have the initial state created, we can just pass it into this create slice. And now the next argument that it takes is a name. And again, this is just a unique name. And for this, I'm just gonna use this constant right here. So name, we can just say speed test manager. And now the last thing that we need to make are reducers. Now in this reducers object, we are gonna be writing quite a few. And these are just objects where the keys are strings and the values of these are functions that we can call to update our state. So behind the scenes, what's actually going to happen, and you'll see it's kind of unique, but it's kind of cool at the same time. Behind the scenes, Redux Toolkit is basically going to merge these keys and functions together to generate action creator functions. And those functions are going to be what we can use in our component to basically, whenever we select the network or account, we're going to dispatch these generated functions, and it's basically just what updates Redux for us. So the first thing that we'll write is the functionality to set the active account number, and I'll name this very creatively, set active account number. And again, that's what you have for the key. Now for the value, it's going to be an anonymous function. And for this function, the first parameter that it takes is the state itself. And what state are you operating on? Well, it's the state of type manager, basically saying that this is going to be the state. So this is the first parameter in pretty much all of these functions that we're going to write. And the second one is a payload action. So let me bring that out in. Okay, let's do this. So this payload action, if we take a look at it, okay, so it has a payload and a type. However, we really don't care about this type at all. We don't use it for anything. So what we're going to do is just destructure the payload. And the payload is what you can think of as the value that you pass in whenever you are trying to set this Redux data. And for this payload, since we're setting the active account number, we just need to pass in an account number. So payload is equal to account number. However, I just want to kind of rename it right here, so it's a little bit easier to read. And the type of data for this account number is it can either be a string or null. So the way that I actually want to write this is that we'll click this and then a list of accounts will pop up and then we can just select one. However, once we have an account number selected, if we click that again, then it's going to be deselected. So that's why I want to be able to pass in null right here. Basically, if you ever want to reset your active account or just wipe it out, you can just pass in null and it's going to do that. All right, so now we pretty much have a function that's going to get created where we're able to pass in an account number, either a string or null. Now, how do we update Redux? Well, this is actually pretty easy because what we're going to do is for the state, which is pretty much just this slice of data right here, we are going to take the active account number property and we're going to set it equal to that account number that we just passed in. And I know if anyone's familiar with Redux, you're probably might be pulling your hair out right now because right here we just had what looks like a big no-no and we're mutating state directly. However, the reason that we are able to do this, and this is a very cool thing about not only Redux Toolkit, but Create Slice right here in the background, it's using a library called immer. Now, how this works is that immer is going to keep track of the changes that we make to this state variable right here. And this state is pretty much like a copy of the real internal state. So once we're done making changes to the state, what immer is going to do, and again, this takes place all in the background, is it pretty much compares our new placeholder state to the real internal state. And then it generates all this proper immutable data for us. And the end result is it allows us to write much cleaner code without having to worry about the internals of Redux or creating all this immutable data on our own. So pretty cool. And then the last line of code that I want to write is this. Let me type it out. So window. Again, I'm going to be getting into this in more detail a little bit later on, probably in another series. But for right now, actually, let me type out this entire thing and then I'll kind of talk through it. So set store value is going to be equal to an object where the key is equal to speed test manager, and the state, current state. So again, like I said, I'm going to be getting into the details of how this IPC communication works a little bit later. But for right now, just to give you a high-level overview, what we're going to do is, since we need to communicate with Node, or in other words, that Electron store to store data on our hard drive, then we're going to be sending some information over what's called an IPC channel. Basically means like communicate with the Node portion of TNBOS. And the first param is just saying that, hey, we're about to set a store value or set some data on our hard drive. And we are going to be setting this value, which is just the current or the updated version of our state, and store this data under the key speed test manager. So whenever we shut down TNBOS and pop it back open again, what's going to happen as part of that initialization or boot process is it's going to look in our Electron store for any data that's currently stored there. And instead of populating this manager slice with this initial data right here, it's going to say, hey, I already found something in there from before, and that's what we're going to use to initialize this app. And we'll be getting into that logic in just a bit, but yeah, there you go. Now, aside from this, we also need to create one more reducer, and that is for setting the active network ID, and it's going to be super similar. So I'll just say set active network ID for the key. Again, the state we're operating on is just the same state, and the payload for this, we'll just call it network ID. And again, it's going to be the same type as valid data that we're going to be passing in, either a string, which is the network ID itself, or null. And then instead of updating the active account number, we want to update the active network ID and set it equal to whatever the payload was that we renamed network ID that we passed in. And then this line of code is the same as well, because again, this state that we want to update in the slice is just equal to this object right here. So now we got our functionality to update the active account number or active network ID. And it looks like that might be all. However, there is one other thing that I want to create, and this is just a utility function that I have in basically all my create slice functions, and this is just set manager. So you know how this function right here is going to be setting this, and this one is setting this. Well, the function that I'm about to write in like 5 seconds is gonna be a function that enables us to set both at the same time. Now, if you're thinking, well, when do we really need that? Because one of these is going to set the account number, one of them is going to set the network. Why would we ever need to set both at the same time? Well, the only time we need this is for that boot process, because what that boot process is going to do is it's going to look under this key and it's going to find both of these that's stored on our hard drive that way. And then it's just going to pretty much save us some time. Instead of like having to call each of these individually, I'm just going to say that this is a function to set this entire slice at once. Now for this, I'm just going to pass in manager is the shape. And now the only other param it takes is this key right here, because that's where it's going to look in our Electron store to try to find this data. And all right, that's all we actually need to write for create slice. And now we're just going to export some things. And all right, so we want to export all of these, and I'll show you something a little bit tricky in just a second. So what we want to do is we want to export set active account number, set active network ID, and set manager. However, what we're going to do is, instead of exporting them from manager.reducers, which it looks like you should do, we're actually going to import them from manager.actions. Now, okay, a key called initial state, name, reducers. Where the heck is manager.actions? So this is part of the hidden magic of Redux Toolkit, and specifically create slice, because like I said, behind the scenes, what's going to happen after we call this function is Redux Toolkit is going to create these action creators by merging this key with this function. And what it's going to allow us to do is basically something like this. In our component, let me just comment this out. So this is actual code, just demoing something. In our component, what we're going to do is we're going to dispatch something like this, set active account number, and we're going to be passing in, let's delete this for a second, like 1, 2, 3. So we're going to end up with these action creator functions that are kind of like self-generated by this create slice function. All right, and last but not least, I want to export this reducer. So export default manager.reducer. So this will be our default export, and yeah, everything looks good to go. So now that we got it taken care of, our manager slice, we can hop over and create the run slice. So we already have that file created for us, and since we're going to be using a very similar structure, let me just import this, and let's see. So instead of speed test manager, it is speed test runs, and we don't need this manager type anymore. Instead, we are going to need this run type and runs. All right, everything else should be the same. And okay, so for the initial run state, actually let me do export const initial state. Again, the shape of this is just going to be a dictionary of runs. So runs, and we'll just keep that equal to an empty dictionary at first. And then after this, let me just go ahead and actually let me save some time and just copy all of this. Okay, so instead of manager, this slice is going to be called runs. The initial state is equal to this initial state, which is the empty dict. And the name of this is going to be speed test runs. So I can delete the speed test manager. And all right, so instead of set manager, we're going to call this set runs. Again, the naming convention I follow is just set and then whatever the slice is named. So set runs, camel case, same thing here. Set manager because it was named manager. And again, that is to set the entire slice all at once. It's kind of the pattern I've been following. Okay, initial test, speed test runs. And now let's go ahead and just copy these because I want to create one action creator function, and that is to set an individual run. So of course the state for this is going to be equal to runs. And for payload, whenever we pass in the payload, it's going to be equal to one of these individual runs. So the payload action, should I just copy that? What we're going to be passing in is a run. So we can rename this to run, but the reason I don't want to do it here, you're going to see in just a bit. Okay, so whenever we pass in a run, what do we want to do? Well, the first thing I want to do is I want to pluck off this run ID. So I'm going to destructure this, plucking off the run ID from payload. Now, the reason that I want to pluck that off is because what I want to do is I want to see if this run already exists in our Redux store. So I'm going to create a variable called run, and it's going to be equal to state run ID. So again, the state refers to this dict or this slice right here. And whenever we are setting a run for the very first time, then there's not going to be any object matching this in our state. However, once we have set it and then we're just setting it again to update it, then it's going to find it. So this run right here is either going to be equal to a run or it's going to be undefined. So why do I care about that? Well, from this line of code right here, whenever we are setting this, we need to find out if the run already exists or not, because if the run already exists, then what we can do is take that previous run or existing data and just update it with any of our new data that we pass in, which is going to be from the payload. Otherwise, if the run does not exist in our store yet, then just go ahead and set this chunk of state to our payload, just like this. And I'm getting an error here. Run not assignable to runs. All right, that was because this runs, which is basically saying that we're going to be storing a dict of runs. I accidentally had runs in here rather than run right here. So there we go. Okay, so this set run is a function that we're going to use both to create a run for the very first time and then also update any existing runs. And then, what error am I getting here? Manager, because the type of this is not manager, it is runs. All right. All right, so initial state, let me just review this real quick. This is name, reducer, looking good. And now, what I want to do is just export everything. So export set run, which allows to set an individual run, and then set runs, which we're going to use on boot to set this entire slice at once, pretty much reading in any previous runs from our hard drive and just setting it. And then by default, I want to have this runs.reducer is just the default export. So now that we have our two main slices created, both the manager slice and the run slice, what we're going to do is create a new file and kind of combine those together. So again, this file is store/index.ts. And to combine slices, we are going to import something from Redux Toolkit and combine reducers. All right, so then we can just import, we'll call it manager reducer. So we're importing the default export, which is basically just this manager reducer. And then we're going to do the same thing for that runs reducer. So from runs, import it as runs reducer. And now how do we combine these? Well, we can go ahead and create a variable. We'll just call it speed test. Get out of here. What am I doing? Speed test reducer. And this is going to be equal to the return value of combine reducers, which is going to take a key value pair with the key being basically what you just want to name that chunk of data, and the manager reducer as a value. So runs reducer, and then we'll just export this entire thing. Export default speed test reducer. All right, and that is really all we need to do to set up the Redux portion of our state management for this app. However, to make TNBOS aware of this, we need to go ahead and add it to our app registration file. So in here, let's see, let's copy this name, and that is apps store. So import speed test reducer from apps speed test store. Now, as part of our app registration, there is another key called reducer, and you set this equal to the root reducer for the app. And in this case, it is speed test reducer. And now that we have it in our registration, we can go into apps registry and pretty much just let our app registry know that we now have a reducer. So since we already have our registration imported, all we need to do is say that we have a new app reducer or a new some more app data that we want to store. And we'll key it under speed test, and we just need to give it the reducer, and then we're gonna have an exclamation after this. And the reason that we need this is because in this app registration type, we have this reducer as an optional key value pair. And the reason for that is because not all apps need to have a reducer. Not all apps need to store data in Redux, so it is optional. However, in this case, we're saying, yes, there is definitely a reducer for this speed test registration, the reducer that we just created. So, you don't have to guess. It's definitely there. That's why we do it. So now with all of that, as long as I didn't miss anything, we should have our Redux storage structure all set up and ready to go. I think should be good. All right, so let me minimize this. Now the moment of truth. Did it appear in our Redux store? Redux, and check it out. All right, So now, in addition to system in chat, we now have this cool speed test slice. And of course we have our manager, which was initialized with this data right here. And then our runs, which was just initialized as an empty dict for now. And there we go. So this is how we set up our Redux structure. However, the one other thing that we have to do now is we need to say that whenever we have data in here, which we don't at the time, but whenever TNBOS boots up for the very first time, we need to tell it how to load that data from our hard drive into this Redux store. So let me actually close this, and we'll do that right now. Now for this function under speedtest store, I'm going to create a new TypeScript file called initializer. And again, this is just going to have one function in it, and its job is to initialize our Redux store whenever we first boot up TNBOS. So let me go ahead and import everything first that we're going to need. So from, let me see if I can steal this from anywhere. So we're first going to need those constants, because remember, those constants tell us which key in the Electron store or on our hard drive all this data is. So speed test manager and speed test runs. And now after this, we're going to be importing from this. We need to import, first of all, the initial state, because if the logic is basically going to work like this. It's going to say, first, whenever you're booting up, check on the hard drive and see if we have any data in there that we can initialize the store with. If not, then we're just going to initialize it to whatever the initial state is right here. So we need to import both this initial state variable, and also this is the function that we're going to use to actually set this data. So in the initializer, we're going to import initial state, and we'll just import it as manager initial state. And the reason that I want to rename it is because we're also going to be importing initial state from another file as well when we don't want to have like initial state 1, initial state 2. So we're going to import the initial state, rename it to manager initial state, and then also this set manager action creator. And we're going to import that from apps.speedtest.store manager. Just copy this and do the same for runs. So import from runs, say runs initial state. So runs initial state is going to be this, which it's going to be the fallback if it can't find any runs data currently in there. And then to set those runs in Redux, we use set runs just like that. Now, another thing that we're going to need is just some type, and that is from shared types. And that is going to be the local Electron store. And this is just the shape of our data on our hard drive. And then one other thing from system types, and that is app dispatch. So that dispatch function that we call to basically set data in Redux, it's going to be of this type, and I just want to make sure everything is typed out properly. All right, so with all this being said, what we can do is we can create a function that's going to be called, is pretty much the initialization function for this app. And I'll just call it load speed test store data. And this is first going to take the dispatch. Did I spell that correctly? All right, so dispatch of type app dispatch in the store is local Electron store. And this function is going to return void. Again, we don't need to return everything because all it's doing is taking data from our hard drive and setting it in our Redux. All right, and now let me just export this by default, and then we'll get into writing. Export default. All right, so the logic for this is actually going to be pretty simple. I'll say, all right, let me make a variable called store manager. And again, what we need to do first is we need to figure out, is there any data on the hard drive, or in other words, the local Electron store already? If so, then we'll use that to set as the data. If not, then we'll just use that initial state as default. So in order to do that, we're going to do store, and we'll add this question mark because the very first time that TNBOS gets initialized, not just this app, but like the entire system. We have the store optional while everything's being initialized. But anyways, just to make TypeScript happy, we need to add that question mark right after. So from this store, which, like I said, is basically our hard drive, we're going to look for data under the key speed test manager. And that's going to be any existing data that was there from the previous time, whenever we have our network and active account selected. Now, if you are initializing this app for the very first time, then you're not going to have this data stored yet. So instead, as a fallback, we'll just use that manager initial state, which is this right here with these two keys initialized to null. All right, so we're either going to have data from the hard drive or the initial state. And now once we have that, to actually set this, we're going to call dispatch set manager, and we're just going to pass in whatever this data is right here. So again, the set manager action creator was just to set this entire state right here. And now, actually, what error am I getting? Yes. So back in our registry, and the error that this is throwing us is saying that, hey, you told me to look in local Electron store for a key called speed test manager. However, if I go to local Electron store right here, then we basically just need to update this type right here, because right now we're saying that our app data, it's only equal to chat Electron store. And what we want to do is we want to make sure that this is equal to both chat Electron store and the speed test Electron store that we just created. So from speed tests, we actually have it from registration right here. Oh, we don't even have it yet. But anyways, what we are looking for is this right here, speed test Electron store. And then we'll just import it right into our registration. So we'll say import speed test Electron store for apps, speed test types. And then we can just export it right here. So speed test Electron store. All right, so we want to have our registration kind of the central point for everything. And now we can import that in the app registry. And all right, and I also want to change this from a type to an interface, since we're basically combining a couple different things now. So let me actually comment that out, and we'll say instead of this app Electron store is a type, we're going to export it as an interface called app Electron store. And this is just going to extend both this chat Electron store and also this speed test Electron store. And we don't need to put anything in the body of the interface. Basically just saying that this app Electron store, there's a lot of Electron stores I'm trying to say, kind of a tongue twister. But anyways, this app Electron store type or interface is a combination of chat Electron store and speed test Electron store. Easy peasy. So now when we pop back in our initializer, this local Electron store should be good to go. And just like we checked if there was any manager data on our hard drive and then dispatched it to Redux during the initialization process, we're going to do the exact same thing for runs data. So this is speed tester runs. So we'll say store runs is equal to any runs data from a hard drive. If you can't find any, then just use that runs initial state, which is just going to be an empty dict. And then once you have one of those, then just go ahead and set it in Redux. So now that we got our initialization function written, what we need to do as the very last step is just add it to our registration. So where is it? Store initialization, import load speed test store data from actually the same location, initializer, and then the function that we just imported right here. The key for this is initializer. And there we go. So we don't need to actually explicitly call this anywhere, like from our registry or anything, because another part of the internal TNBOS boot process is it's going to look for all of these registrations, and right after the system data is loaded, it's going to go through each of these one by one, and it's going to check, is there an initializer function that exists? If there is one that exists, then I'm just going to go ahead and call it. So again, that's why we don't need to like explicitly call it or anything. It's just part of the internal interworkings, I guess you could say. So with this being said, let me just go ahead and restart this app and see if anything broke. All right, it is looking all right, but just to kind of verify that, let me do this. I'll verify that everything is being initialized correctly by doing this. So for dispatch, so what I'll do, even though we never actually want to do this, but just for testing things out, I'm going to set some manager data. So I'll just set active account number to like bacon, and then the active network ID to tuna. And let me pretty up this. All right, so on boot, if everything's working correctly, then it's just gonna set like this dummy data for manager. So let's see if it's set that, first of all. All right, speed test, manager. Okay, looks like our dummy data was in there. So now what I'm gonna do is close this, and I'm actually gonna be deleting this because right now that data not only should it be set in Redux, which we just confirmed, but it should also be set on our hard drive. Now, the reason that I wanted to have that is because whenever I boot this up again, then instead of pulling this manager initial state, it should have found that data on the hard drive, even though we just removed that dispatch function. And as long as we see some bacon and tuna, then everything should be working correctly. Redux, speed test, manager, bacon, and tuna. All right, so this means that it is correctly loading in that data from our hard drive. Everything is persisting properly. And by the way, this right here, this is basically how we're going to be using or setting this Redux data from our components. So yeah, I think that's good for this video. And in the next one, what we'll do is we'll go through and start hooking up all of these components to Redux. Should be pretty sweet. So yeah, see you then.